Okay, credit rating agencies. They're supposed to be our watchdogs for financial risk. Yeah.
That's the idea, absolutely.
But I mean, ever since the 2008 crisis, they've gotten so much flack, a lot of criticism.
Oh, definitely. A huge amount.
And the big complaint is, look, they have this private access, they talk to the CEOs, the CFOs,
Right, they're supposed to have the inside track.
but then, boom, disaster strikes, and people ask, why didn't the ratings show this earlier? Why were they so slow? Some people even said the ratings had, like, little or no informational value. Pretty harsh.
It is harsh, and it hits at that core tension.
Mm-hmm.
They supposedly know things privately, but do the public ratings actually reflect that knowledge quickly?
Exactly. So that's what we're digging into today. Do these agencies really bake that critical, negative, private information into their ratings? And crucially, do they do it on time?
And we're looking at some research that uses a really interesting angle to get at this.
Yeah, this study uses this novel data set. It's confidential SEC investigations.
Which is clever, because SEC investigations, usually totally non-public, at least initially.
Right. So it's a perfect example of significant negative news that starts out private. So our mission here for you listening is to figure out, are these rating agencies, these gatekeepers, really clued in when trouble might be brewing?
And importantly, do they act on that private information before it all hits the fan publicly? Are the ratings telling us something hidden?
Let's get into it. What did the data actually show? First big question. Are ratings, different when a company's being secretly investigated by the SEC?
Well, the researchers looked at S&P ratings specifically for listed firms under investigation between 1995 and 2017.
And how did they figure out the impact since it's secret?
They used a statistical method, a difference in differences model. Basically, it lets you compare the firm's rating during the investigation versus other times while trying to account for, other stuff that affects ratings.
Okay, makes sense. So the punchline, did the secret investigations matter for the public ratings?
Yes. Big finding. Ratings were significantly lower when a firm was under investigation.
Lower by how much? Like a tiny bit or noticeably?
On average, about 0.3 notches lower.
0.3 notches. Okay, maybe it doesn't sound like a huge number on its own. Is that actually significant in the grand scheme of ratings?
It is, actually. So that 0.3 notches, it's about 21% of the typical up and down we see in a company's rating.
Ah, okay, so a decent chunk of the normal variation.
Exactly. And what's really striking is they found this effect is roughly twice as large as the impact you'd see from a similar-sized hit to the company's profits.
Wow. Twice as big as a profit drop effect.
Yeah. So the takeaway is, even though the investigation is secret, the rating is already reflecting trouble. And that reflection is pretty weighty, comparable to, say, a big earnings miss becoming public.
Okay, so that's finding one. Ratings are lower during secret investigations. But here's where it gets, really fascinating for me. Can the agencies tell the difference between a minor poke from the SEC and, something really serious brewing? Are they just reacting vaguely, or do they have a sharper sense of things?
That was the next step. They investigated whether the CRAs could figure out the materiality, basically. Could they predict if an investigation would actually lead to a formal enforcement action?
Like the SEC publicly charging the company with something serious.
Exactly. Specifically, those accounting and auditing enforcement releases, or AAERs, those are the big ones, signaling significant issues.
Okay, and could they? Did the ratings reflect that potential severity?
They absolutely did. The finding here was that the rating downgrades were over 3 times larger for investigations that eventually resulted in one of those AARs compared to investigations that just fizzled out.
Whoa, 3 times bigger.
Yep, 3 times.
So it's not just a general dip. When the really bad stuff is happening under the surface, the rating agencies seem to be signaling a much, much bigger problem.
Precisely. It suggests they're not just reacting to the fact of an investigation, but they're forming pretty sophisticated expectations about how serious it is well before anything becomes public.
That really feels like an aha moment. They seem to have an early read.
It points to a deeper level of analysis or perhaps information gathering than just knowing an investigation exists.
Right. Now, how big a deal are these rating adjustments during SEC investigations compared to other, maybe more obvious red flags? Did the researchers put that into context?
They did. They benchmark it. They compared the rating changes linked to SEC investigations against other significant negative events.
Like what sort of events?
Things like Big earnings misses when profits really undershoot expectations. Also, debt covenant violations,
Yeah.
breaking the rules of a loan agreement.
Yeah, that can be serious.
And also large negative equity price shocks, basically. The stock price taking a sudden big dive in a month.
Okay, those all sound like things that would definitely worry creditors and should affect a rating. So how did the SEC investigation effects stack up?
Pretty strongly. The rating adjustments for SEC investigations were economically and statistically very similar in size to the adjustments after those big earnings misses and the major stock price drops.
So on par with those big public signals?
Yes. And interestingly, the rating dip was actually larger than what they saw after debt covenant violations.
Huh. Larger than breaking loan rules. That's telling.
And then, when they drilled down specifically to those investigations that led to the really serious AAERs.
The ones where the downgrade was 3 times bigger.
Right. For those, the downgrades were even greater than for all 3 of those benchmarks: the earnings miss, the stock drop, and the covenant violation.
Wow. Okay, so this really underlines that these secret SEC probes are a major piece of the credit risk picture, maybe even more significant in the CRA's view than some of these other well-known indicators.
It certainly seems that way. It suggests the CRA see these investigations, especially the serious ones, as fundamentally important signals about the company's health or integrity.
It definitely makes you look at ratings differently, knowing they might be capturing this kind of hidden weight.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about timing. That's the other big criticism, right? That CRAs are just too slow. Did this research tackle when these rating adjustments happen?
Yes, that was crucial. They used a slightly different analysis for this, looking quarter by quarter right around the start date of the SEC investigation.
To pinpoint the reaction time.
Exactly. To see how quickly the rating moved after the investigation kicked off. Again, remembering this start date isn't public.
Were they fast or slow off the mark?
The evidence points strongly towards timely action. They found ratings were significantly lower in the very first quarter right after the investigation began.
The first quarter, so within potentially just weeks or a couple of months.
That's right. And the ratings stayed lower in the following quarters, too.
That seems pretty quick, actually, for incorporating complex, non-public information.
It does. And again, the effect was even clearer for those investigations heading towards an AAER.
How much lower did those go?
For those serious cases, the ratings were down about 1 full notch by the 7th quarter after the investigation started.
A whole notch. That's a major move in credit ratings. And you're saying this is happening way before the AAER itself is usually published.
On average, yes. Considerably before the public announcement of the enforcement action.
That really pushes back against the slow reaction narrative, doesn't it? At least in this context, it sounds like they're processing this stuff relatively fast.
It certainly suggests a capacity for rapid incorporation of significant private information.
But hang on, how do we know it's the private info about the investigation driving this? Couldn't S&P just be reacting to, I don't know, rumors or other negative public news that just happened to surface around the same time?
That's a fair question. A really important one. And the researchers had a clever way to test this. They brought in another rating agency, Egan-Jones, or EJR.
Egan-Jones? What's different about them?
Well, EJR explicitly states their ratings are based only on publicly available information. They don't claim to have that same kind of private access to management that the big agencies like S&P do.
Oh, okay. So EJR acts as a sort of control group. If S&P moves and EJR doesn't, that points to the private info S&P has.
Exactly the logic. They compared S&P and EJR ratings for the same set of firms around the time an SEC investigation started.
And what happened? Did EJR's ratings dip too?
Nope. The study found EJR ratings showed no significant change after an SEC investigation began. But, crucially, a significant gap opened up between S&P's ratings and EJR's ratings during that time.
There it is again, another aha. The public info-only agency doesn't react, but S&P does. That really strengthens the case that S&P's downgrades are linked to their private knowledge of the investigation.
It provides pretty compelling evidence isolating the private information effect, yes.
Okay, so S&P seems to know. They react relatively quickly. But does the market care? Do investors even pick up on the significance of a downgrade that happens during one of these secret investigations?
Good question. Does it carry more weight? They looked at stock market reactions to downgrades.
Comparing downgrades during investigations to, like, normal downgrades?
Precisely. And they found that downgrades issued while a firm was under SEC investigation triggered more negative stock market reactions than other downgrades.
Interesting. So the market does seem to sense something's different.
It appears so. And, consistent with the other findings, This negative reaction was even stronger if the investigation eventually led to an AAER.
It's like the market reads the tea leaves and thinks, uh-oh, a downgrade now. With the SEC sniffing around privately, this might be worse than usual.
That's a good way to put it. It suggests these specific downgrades are conveying valuable, perhaps previously hidden, negative information to investors.
Okay, one last piece then. Could these rating downgrades actually help the market figure things out sooner? Could they be an early warning signal before the bad news about an investigation, like an AAER, becomes fully public?
They explored that too. They looked at whether downgrades could lead to timelier price discovery, basically. Does the stock price reflect the bad news faster?
How did they measure that?
They used a metric called intraperiod price timeliness, IPT. It measures how quickly new information gets baked into the stock price within a given period. They looked at the 60 days before public news broke about AAR-related investigations like a company announcement or a news report.
Right. And did downgrades in that 60-day window seem to speed things up?
Yes. They found that a rating downgrade happening in those 60 days before the public disclosure was associated with faster price discovery. The stock price adjusted more quickly.
So the downgrade acts like a bit of a heads up, allowing the market to start pricing in the bad news a bit earlier than it might have otherwise.
It suggests that these ratings, even with all the criticism they get, can serve as a channel, maybe an imperfect one, but a channel nonetheless for significant private information to filter into market prices.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, let's try and boil this down. Key takeaways from this deep dive.
I think the big ones are, first, CRAs, or at least S&P in this study, do seem to access and use private information about these SEC investigations. It's not just public data. Second, they do it in a reasonably timely way, reacting in the first quarter. And sophisticatedly, too, differentiating between serious and less serious probes before public charges.
Right, the 3 times larger downgrade for AA cases.
Exactly. And third, these rating actions, particularly downgrades during investigations, seem to provide valuable, new information to the market, which reacts more strongly and potentially discovers prices faster.
So it definitely challenges that blanket criticism that CRAs are always late or that their ratings lack private information, at least when it comes to this specific, important type of event, SEC investigations.
It certainly provides a strong counter-narrative in this context. Doesn't mean they were perfect everywhere else. But here, the evidence suggests they are incorporating private signals.
Okay, so here's a final thought maybe for you to chew on. If CRAs are picking up these private signals about regulatory probes, what other kinds of non-public whispers might they be hearing?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah, like issues with suppliers, internal strategy shifts, potential M&A talks gone sour. How much of that kind of stuff might be influencing ratings behind the scenes? It really makes you think about the true information landscape these agencies operate in.
It really does. It highlights the potential and maybe the opacity of non-public information flows in shaping our understanding of corporate risk through these ratings.
Definitely gives you a new lens to look through when you see a rating change.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to explore this further, the research itself is out there and makes for a compelling read.
Agreed.
And that wraps up this deep dive.